Everyone assumed they knew what happened inside Nancy Guthrie's home. A violent struggle, chaos, noise, the kind of scene that leaves a house in disarray, furniture displaced, objects broken, evidence of a person fighting for their life scattered across multiple rooms. That assumption was wrong. And the detail that proves it wrong is one that investigators knew from the earliest days of this case. A detail that was never shared with the public, never addressed in a press conference, never mentioned in the official timeline. Until now. The blood inside Nancy Guthrie's home did not start in the bedroom. It did not start in the hallway. It did not start in the kitchen or the living room or any of the spaces a person moves through when they are struggling, resisting, or trying to escape. It started at the front entrance, just inside the front door, in one location, in a pattern that is identical to the pattern outside. And what that pattern tells a trained forensic expert, someone who has analyzed bloodstain evidence in courtrooms across 7 states and in federal court, is not a story of violence and chaos. It is a story of control. Deliberate, slow, methodical. The story of a person who knew exactly what they were doing, who moved through a woman's home without leaving visible evidence of force, and who reached that front threshold carrying Nancy Guthrie in a way that only a forensic expert can fully decode. Tonight we examine the blood evidence inside Nancy Guthrie's home. We examine what journalist Ashley Banfield confirmed through multiple independent sources after 52 days of silence on this critical detail. We examine the analysis of Dr. Peter Valentine, Associate Professor and Department Chair of Forensic Science at the University of New Haven, a man who has testified as a bloodstain pattern expert in 7 states and federal court, and what his forensic conclusions reveal about how Nancy was moved, what position she was in, and why the evidence may have placed blood on the back of the perpetrator's clothing that he may never have thought to destroy. We examine the back door that was found standing wide open, the crime scene released in approximately 30 hours, the welcome mat and the camera bracket that were not collected immediately, and the question that forensic expert Dr. Valentine said should concern everyone following this case. Did investigators go to that scene with the wrong assumption about what kind of crime this was? This investigation is not closed. Nancy Guthrie has not been found. But the forensic story of what happened in that front entrance, the 16 minutes between when the doorbell camera went dark and when her pacemaker sent its final signal, is a story that the blood evidence has been waiting to tell. Before we go deeper into this investigation, if you believe that cases like this one deserve serious, thorough, forensically grounded coverage, the kind that examines the evidence with precision, asks the questions the official record leaves open, and never looks away from what the facts actually show, subscribe to Unclosed Files right now and hit the notification bell. We follow the forensic trail wherever it leads. New investigations every single week. If this case is already on your mind, hit that like button and tell me in the comments. What do you think the blood pattern inside that front entrance reveals about what happened during those 16 minutes? Leave your analysis below. I read every single one. Now let's build this from the evidence up. Nancy Guthrie was a woman who had lived in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona, for more than 50 years. She had raised her 3 children in that house. She was, by every account, cognitively sharp, fully present, and deeply independent. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos described her publicly with precision. Sharp as a tack, no cognitive impairment, no wandering, no confusion about where she was or what she was doing. Her daughter Savannah Guthrie is one of the most recognizable faces in American morning television, co-anchor of NBC's Today Show since 2012. Her daughter Annie lived nearby in Tucson. Her son Cameron had spent his career in military intelligence. Nancy lived alone in a house she knew as well as any person knows a home they have occupied for 5 decades. On the evening of Saturday, January 31st, 2026, Nancy had dinner at her daughter Annie's home. Her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni, drove her back to her own house. Doorbell camera footage captured her garage door opening at approximately 9:48 p.m. At 9:50 p.m., it closed. She was inside. She appeared well. It looked exactly like every other Saturday evening she had shared with her family for years. The following morning, she did not appear for her Sunday church service. Family members arrived at her home around 11:56 a.m. and found she was not there. At 12:03 p.m., they called 911. What investigators found at the scene changed everything within hours. Nancy's phone was inside the house. Her medication was still there. Her purse, her wallet, her vehicle, all left behind. Evidence inside the home indicated she had not left voluntarily. And on the front porch and front walkway, visible to the first responders and to journalists who documented the scene in the days that followed, there was a trail of blood droplets confirmed by DNA testing to belong to Nancy Guthrie. That blood trail became the most examined piece of physical evidence in this case. Multiple forensic experts offered public analysis based on photographs and video. Forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Baden told Fox News Digital that the blood droplets indicated Nancy was bleeding from either her hands or her face, that the nature of the spots with their pale centers and donut shapes was consistent with blood mixed with air, suggesting it came from the nose or mouth. Forensic scientist Dr. Amy Santoro, speaking on the Megyn Kelly Show, described the distribution as indicating someone bleeding at a significant rate. Retired FBI Special Agent Maureen O'Connell told News Nation's Brian Enton that in her assessment, the pattern was consistent with Nancy being carried and wrapped in something, pointing specifically to the absence of void patterns that would typically indicate a person walking through the blood on their own. But through all of that public analysis, through all those weeks of expert commentary, one critical piece of information was never shared. The blood did not begin outside. The blood began inside. Ashley Banfield, the veteran journalist who has reported on this case with extraordinary precision through her Drop Dead Serious program, confirmed through multiple independent sources what investigators had known since the earliest days. Blood was found just inside Nancy Guthrie's front door. The droplets inside the home matched the pattern outside, the same circular shape, the same undisturbed vertical fall. The blood went from inside, over the threshold, and down the front walkway to the point where it stopped, at a location consistent with where a vehicle would have been parked. Banfield had been told by a source on day 3 of the investigation that there was blood inside the home. A second source confirmed it, and that second source added something critical. When the first deputies arrived and saw what was inside, they understood immediately that this required a more experienced team. They called in homicide investigators. That is the first time this information has been made fully public. And to understand what it means, forensically, investigatively, and operationally, you need to understand what Dr. Peter Valentin found when he analyzed the pattern. Dr. Valentin is an associate professor and department chair of forensic science at the University of New Haven. He has testified as a bloodstain pattern expert in 7 states and in federal court. He does not speculate. He reads physical evidence the way a trained reader reads a document, looking for what the pattern confirms, what it excludes, and what it implies about the movement and state of a person at a specific moment in time. He identified the blood as drip stains, blood falling from a source purely by gravity with no applied force or directional energy, not blood from a violent impact, not blood from a struggle, blood dripping, falling straight down, creating circular patterns on the floor and the threshold beneath. And that distinction between blood that falls and blood that is projected carries forensic weight that cannot be overstated. Here is what vertical, undisturbed drip stains tell an expert. This was slow. This was controlled. This was deliberate. When a person runs, the blood droplets stretch in the direction of movement and show a tail. When a person is dragged, the droplets smear and distort. When there is a physical struggle in close quarters, the pattern shows disruption, footprints through the stains, smearing where people moved, the kind of chaotic evidence that reflects chaos in real time. None of that existed here. The droplets were circular. The source was directly overhead, falling straight down. The droplets were undisturbed. No one stepped through them. No one disturbed them with movement. And then Dr. Valentin identified something that reframes the entire timeline of what happened at that threshold. Some of the droplets showed what he described as satellite spatter, secondary droplets, tiny radiating marks created when blood falls into blood that has already accumulated on the surface. A drop lands. Another drop falls into that first drop. The impact creates a small splash. Tiny droplets radiate outward in a circular pattern. Satellite spatter happens when a source of blood remains stationary for what Dr. Valentin called a not insignificant amount of time. Not passing through, not moving quickly, stopped. Something happened at that threshold that required time. Something that caused Nancy, or whoever was carrying Nancy, to pause. The most likely explanation, based on the physical evidence and the layout of the home, the front door. A heavy door that needs to be managed while carrying another person. Opened, held, negotiated. During that pause, blood dripped, then dripped again. And the second drop fell into the first, creating that satellite pattern. The forensic record of a moment when someone stood at Nancy Guthrie's threshold long enough to leave evidence they could not erase. Now we need to address the question that had been asked extensively before this internal blood detail became known. Where did the blood not appear? No blood was found in the bedroom. No blood trail through the hallway leading from the bedroom toward the front of the house. No blood in the kitchen or living areas. No evidence of a physical confrontation in any of the spaces between the bedroom and the front entrance. This is where Dr. Valentin's forensic experience provides critical context. The absence of blood in the bedroom does not mean nothing happened in the bedroom. Blood does not always begin flowing immediately after an injury. It accumulates. It takes time to reach the surface of skin, to penetrate clothing, to build enough volume to drip. A person can sustain an injury and be moved through a space before blood reaches the threshold at which it begins to fall. Dr. Valentin explained this precisely. Nancy could have been injured in her bedroom. The blood could have been absorbed initially by her clothing or hair. As she was carried through the house, past the bedroom doorway, through the hall, through the interior of the home toward the front, the blood accumulated. By the time she reached the front entrance, it had built to a volume sufficient to drip, and at that point, it dripped in a slow, undisturbed, vertical pattern that told a forensic expert everything about the pace of movement and the level of control being exercised. That timeline is more disturbing than a story of visible chaos. It means Nancy was controlled in her bedroom without leaving the visible evidence that would tell responders exactly what happened there. She was moved through her own home without leaving a trail, and only at the front entrance, when the blood had accumulated enough, did the physical record of her abduction begin to appear. Now consider how she was positioned to create that pattern. Ashley Banfield, working with Dr. Valentin's analysis, developed a theory based on the evidence. The theory is grounded in the physics of the blood pattern and the known constraints of the situation. If Nancy was being carried over the perpetrator's shoulder, her upper body hanging down behind him, her head would be in a position where blood from her face or nose could fall straight down behind him as he walked. The pattern would be vertical. It would fall in his path of movement. It would not be disrupted by his feet because he would be walking forward while the blood fell behind him. When he reached the threshold and stopped to manage the door, blood would continue falling in one location, accumulating, creating the satellite spatter that Dr. Valentin identified. When he adjusted to step through the doorway, repositioning to negotiate the frame, the shift in Nancy's position relative to his shoulder could have compressed her diaphragm slightly, creating a change in the blood flow at that specific moment. Dr. Valentin was asked directly whether this theory was consistent with the evidence. His response was precise and unequivocal. He said he found it as plausible as anything else he had heard to that point. And then he added the detail that has the most direct investigative implications of anything in his entire analysis. If Nancy was carried in that position, blood was falling on the back of the perpetrator's clothing, between the shoulder blades, on the rear of a jacket or shirt, blood that he may never have seen, blood that he would not have thought to clean because he could not see it, blood that could be sitting right now on clothing folded in a drawer, hung in a closet, or buried in a bag somewhere in Tucson or beyond. Dr. Valentin was explicit about the investigative significance. When people attempt to clean blood evidence from themselves, they focus on what they can see: the front of a shirt, the hands, the pants. They do not check the back. They cannot see the back without a mirror and deliberate attention. And the back, the area between the shoulder blades on the clothing of someone who carried a person in that position, would contain blood that is extraordinarily difficult to completely remove even with deliberate effort. The chemical components of blood persist beyond what the eye can detect. Luminol and other forensic reagents designed to find cleaned blood can expose it even when it appears visibly absent. That evidence is still out there. It is the kind of detail that closes cases, the evidence the perpetrator may have no idea he left behind. There is a second forensic layer to the blood pattern that extends beyond the threshold and into the walkway, and it connects to a detail that retired FBI Special Agent Maureen O'Connell flagged publicly that has not received the analytical attention it deserves. O'Connell, speaking to News Nation's Brian Enton, noted something specific about the blood distribution on the walkway outside: the absence of void patterns. A void pattern in bloodstain analysis is exactly what it sounds like: a gap in the blood distribution caused by something physically blocking the droplets from reaching the surface. If a person is walking upright through their own blood, their feet create voids. The area beneath each footfall shows less blood than the surrounding surface because the foot is temporarily blocking the fall path. If a person is being dragged, their body mass creates a different kind of disruption: smearing, directional distortion, evidence of contact between a body and a surface. Neither of those patterns was present. What was present was a clean distribution of vertical drip stains extending from the inside of the threshold down the walkway to the point where the blood stopped. O'Connell said directly, in her mind, Nancy was wrapped in something and being carried. The absence of voids was consistent with a person whose body was elevated above the surface, not walking, not dragging, not in contact with the ground at all. Dr. Valentin's analysis is consistent with this conclusion. The circular, undisturbed pattern on both sides of the threshold, inside and outside, identical in character, reflects a source that was elevated above the surface and moving at a pace slow enough to allow the blood to fall straight down rather than projecting at an angle. No angling means no running. No smearing means no dragging. The physical evidence excludes the scenarios of a chaotic, high-speed extraction. It is consistent with a person being carried with a level of deliberate physical control that left the bloodstain pattern undisturbed. Now consider what Paulette Sutton, who spent more than 40 years in bloodstain pattern analysis with the Shelby County Medical Examiner's Office, contributed to the public record on this case. Sutton described the trail outside as a drip trail, indicating a continuous source of blood dripping from a person rather than an object. She noted that if Nancy was on blood-thinning medication, which she was for her heart condition, she would bleed more profusely from the same injury than a person not on blood thinners. That context matters to the volume assessment. The amount of blood visible in the photographs and documented by journalists who were at the scene is not necessarily indicative of a catastrophic injury when you factor in the blood-thinning effect of Nancy's medication. It may reflect a smaller injury producing more blood than it would in a person without that medical history. That is not a reassuring conclusion, but it is a forensically precise one. The volume of blood does not, by itself, resolve the question of Nancy's condition. It tells us she was bleeding. It tells us the bleeding was sustained enough to produce a visible trail. And it tells us, given her medication, that the injury producing that trail may be smaller than the volume would suggest to someone without forensic training. What the combined analysis of multiple independent experts establishes, when taken together, is a coherent physical picture of what happened at that front entrance. Nancy was carried. She was elevated above the ground. The blood from her injury fell vertically, undisturbed in circular drip stains that are inconsistent with struggle, dragging, or rapid movement. The source of the bleeding was likely her face, nose, or hands, as both Dr. Michael Baden and the overall pattern analysis suggest. The pause at the threshold was not momentary. The satellite spatter documents a stationary period long enough for blood to fall into blood, and the trail stopped at the vehicle location, not because the bleeding stopped on the walkway, but because Nancy was repositioned when she was placed in the vehicle, changing the geometry of how and where the blood could fall. Every one of those conclusions is drawn from the physical evidence, not from speculation, not from theory, from the blood itself. Now we need to examine the back door. When investigators first arrived at Nancy Guthrie's home on the morning of February 1st, they found the back door standing wide open, not unlocked, not ajar, wide open, visible straight through the house from the moment you stepped through the front entrance. Nancy's family had indicated to investigators that she routinely left her back doors unlocked. In the Catalina foothills, a quiet, established neighborhood at the base of the Santa Catalina Mountains, many residents operated with a level of physical trust in their environment. But there is a meaningful forensic distinction between a door that is unlocked and a door that is standing open. An unlocked door requires knowledge. You have to try the handle to know it is not secured. A door standing wide open has been opened by someone and not closed behind them. The operational picture that emerges from the evidence is this. The perpetrator likely entered through that unlocked back door. That means he knew the back door would be unlocked. Whether that knowledge came from surveillance of the property, from prior access, or from information provided by someone familiar with Nancy's habits, is an open investigative question. He moved through the house to the bedroom. He controlled Nancy there in a way that did not immediately produce visible blood evidence. He carried her back through the house toward the front entrance. As he approached the front, blood began to fall. At the threshold, he paused to manage the door. Blood accumulated. He moved through, walked down the front walkway, and reached the location where a vehicle was waiting. The blood trail stopped there, and the back door remained standing open. Left that way because in the execution of a planned operation, closing it behind him was either unnecessary or forgotten. This brings us to the question of the crime scene itself, and to the analysis that Dr. Valentin offered about the decisions made in the early hours of this investigation that may have permanent consequences for its resolution. Nancy Guthrie's crime scene was released back to the family in approximately 30 hours after her disappearance was reported. Dr. Valentin was asked directly whether that was appropriate. His answer was unequivocal. He said he would have held that house for as long as he possibly could. He explained why with forensic precision. The Nancy Guthrie case falls into a rare category, a case in which the forensic evidence is the primary driver of the investigation rather than a supporting element. In most criminal cases, physical evidence confirms what detectives develop through witness interviews and suspect identification. The forensic work runs in parallel, building the evidentiary foundation. But in some cases, Dr. Valentin estimated between 5 and 10%. There are no witnesses, no obvious suspect, no clear motive pointing to a specific person. In those cases, the physical evidence is not supporting the investigation. It is the investigation. It is the only story available, and you protect it at all costs. He pointed to specific items that should have been collected immediately and were not. The welcome mat at Nancy's front door. It remained visible and accessible for days after the crime scene was released. Journalists photographed it. Visitors to the memorial that formed outside her home walked near it. That mat, Dr. Valentin explained, could contain trace evidence connecting a suspect to the scene. Fibers from a vehicle's interior, soil from a specific geographic location, microscopic materials from clothing or footwear. Processing a doormat is painstaking forensic work. Thousands of pieces of environmental debris would need to be sorted. But within that debris could be the one fiber or one soil sample that breaks this case. The mat should have been collected, sealed, and preserved within the first hours. Instead, it remained exposed to weather, foot traffic, and contamination. The bracket that held Nancy's Nest doorbell camera. The perpetrator physically manipulated that device. He touched the bracket. If he had a light source in his mouth, a common operational technique, his saliva would have transferred to his gloved fingers and from his gloves to the bracket. DNA evidence degrades. The bracket was not collected for approximately 3 weeks after the crime. By the time it was recovered, any biological material on the surface may have been significantly compromised by heat, UV exposure, and the extreme conditions of a Tucson February in the desert. Dr. Valentin described these as unforced errors, mistakes made under pressure that cannot be undone. The pressure of multiple agencies trying to coordinate a high-profile investigation in real time. The pressure of intense national media coverage. The pressure of a prominent family and public distress. In that environment, the instinct is to show progress, to make decisions quickly, to demonstrate that the investigation is moving. And in his professional experience, Dr. Valentin said, that pressure is exactly where evidence gets missed and opportunities are lost. Sheriff Nanos himself acknowledged this in the early weeks. Asked whether he would have done anything differently, he said, essentially, Monday morning quarterback, I probably would have held the scene longer. That was an admission. A recognition that in hindsight the decision to release the scene was premature. In a more recent interview, weeks later, that position changed. Sheriff Nanos said he had no regrets about how his team handled the scene. The earlier acknowledgement of possible error had been replaced by a public defense of the decisions made. Dr. Valentin did not comment on that shift directly, but his methodology speaks for itself. When forensic evidence is the primary story, when there are no witnesses, no confirmed suspect, no verified motive, protecting that evidence is not optional. Every hour the scene is active is an hour in which that evidence can be collected. Every hour after it is released is an hour in which it cannot. There is one more dimension of Dr. Valentin's analysis that deserves careful examination. and it connects the forensic evidence to the investigative decisions in a way that has direct consequences for what can still be recovered. Dr. Valentine described his methodology for processing crime scenes with a phrase that applies precisely to what happened at Nancy Guthrie's home. He said, "When you walk into a house, that house tells a story. The story is about how the person who lives there maintains their space, what is normal for them, what has been disrupted. The key is recognizing what has changed from the normal state. But you cannot identify what is abnormal until you understand what is normal. And the only way to understand what is normal is to process the scene methodically. Walk through every room, document everything. Let the scene reveal its story rather than imposing assumptions onto the scene." He described it as reading a book. If you skip ahead, you do not understand the characters or the plot. You miss the critical details that give later events meaning. You arrive at a conclusion without the foundation that makes the conclusion credible. The question Dr. Valentine raised, and left open, is whether investigators went to Nancy Guthrie's home on the morning of February 1st with the right understanding of what kind of crime they were processing. The first responders who arrived initially believed they were responding to a missing elderly woman, a possible wandering case, a confusion event. That framing, missing rather than abducted, shapes how you process a scene. You look for signs of voluntary departure. You look for confusion. You do not necessarily look for the subtle trace evidence of a controlled, methodical abduction in which violence was applied without leaving the kind of visible, dramatic evidence that signals a violent crime to untrained eyes. When more experienced investigators arrived and saw what was inside, including the blood inside the front entrance, they understood the case differently. But by then, the framing had already shaped the initial response. Time had passed. The scene had been processed under one assumption before it was processed under the correct one. Dr. Valentine emphasized that in the rare category of cases where forensic evidence is the primary investigative driver, you protect the scene at all costs because you understand what you are dealing with from the beginning. You do not release the scene in approximately 30 hours. You do not allow environmental exposure of critical trace evidence. You do not defer the collection of a doormat or a camera bracket because those items do not look like evidence to someone without forensic training. The decision to call in homicide investigators when the deputies saw the blood inside was correct. The decision to treat the home as a crime scene was correct. But those correct decisions came after the initial response had already been shaped by an incorrect assumption, and the decision to release the scene approximately 30 hours into the investigation, under the pressure of a high-profile case with national media attention, a prominent family, and multiple agencies trying to demonstrate progress, may have cost this investigation evidence that can never be recovered. Sheriff Nanos's early acknowledgement that he would have held the scene longer was an honest assessment. His later revision of that position into a defense of his team's handling does not change the forensic reality that Dr. Valentine described with professional clarity. Evidence was missed, opportunities were lost. Cases of this type depend entirely on the physical record, and in the physical record of this case, there are gaps that should not exist. This is not an assignment of blame for its own sake. It is a forensic accounting of what the evidence tells us and what it cannot tell us, and why some of what it cannot tell us may be traceable to decisions made in the early hours of February 1st, 2026. Let us also examine what the blood pattern tells us about the person who created it. Slow movement. Circular, undisturbed droplets. No void pattern suggesting a walking person in the blood. No smearing. No disruption. A pause at the threshold long enough to create satellite spatter. A controlled, deliberate pace from inside the home to the vehicle parked at the end of the walkway. This is not the behavioral signature of someone acting impulsively. This is not someone who broke in and panicked. This is not someone who encountered an unexpected situation and responded to it chaotically. This is someone who arrived at Nancy Guthrie's home knowing what they intended to do, moved through it with a level of physical control that left almost no collateral forensic evidence, and exited with the same deliberate pace that characterized every other documented aspect of this operation. The doorbell footage released by the FBI on February 10th shows the same signature. The suspect approached Nancy's front door with his right shoulder angled toward the camera, his head turned away. Rick Castigar, who spent 46 years with the Pima County Sheriff's Office, analyzed that footage and said directly, That tells you he knew where the camera was. That is not something you figure out in the moment. That is preparatory knowledge, reconnaissance that happened before the night of February 1st, confirmed by the FBI's own independent focus on January 11th as a critical date in the surveillance timeline. 3 weeks of preparation, multiple visits to this neighborhood, a planned entry through a door known to be unlocked, a controlled extraction that left almost no visible trace in the bedroom or the interior of the house, a forensic record that begins at the threshold and tells a specific, decipherable story to someone trained to read it. And somewhere beyond that threshold, in a vehicle, on a piece of clothing, in the back of a jacket that may be hanging undisturbed in a closet right now, there is more evidence waiting to be found. Now we need to talk about what these forensic revelations mean for the question this case has asked from its first hour. Where is Nancy Guthrie, and what condition is she in? The volume of blood documented at the scene, inside the entrance and along the walkway, is significant but, according to forensic analysis, not necessarily indicative of a catastrophic injury. Multiple experts have characterized it as consistent with bleeding at a notable rate, potentially from the face or nose, possibly connected to blood-thinning medication. Dr. Valentin was careful in his assessment. This is an injury that requires medical attention, but the blood evidence at the scene does not by itself indicate that the injury was immediately life-threatening. What the blood evidence cannot tell us is what happened after Nancy was placed in that vehicle. It cannot tell us whether she received care. It cannot tell us about any additional injuries that may have occurred after that walkway in that moment. It tells us about one specific injury that was bleeding at a specific time. It does not tell us about the totality of what Nancy experienced, or what the days and weeks since February 1st have held for her. What investigators can say with certainty, based on the forensic analysis of blood in vehicle cases, is this: that vehicle contains evidence. Blood is extraordinarily difficult to remove completely from a vehicle interior. The chemical components persist after visual cleaning. Luminol and other specialized reagents can find blood that has been scrubbed away, that appears visually absent, that a person cleaning under pressure in the dark would believe they had eliminated. If that vehicle can be identified, and the FBI has been building a surveillance-based picture of vehicles in the area from a wide sweep of neighborhood cameras, the forensic testing is straightforward. Test for latent blood, compare DNA, build the case. Dr. Valentin's message to investigators was direct. Finding that vehicle is critical. The blood evidence tells us it exists, it is out there, and it contains evidence. Savannah Guthrie, in her first public interview since her mother's disappearance, described waking up in the middle of the night every night, and in the darkness imagining her mother's experience. She said, "Those thoughts demand to be thought, and I will not hide my face." She said her family is in agony. She said it is unbearable. And she said the thing that has haunted her most: the question of whether her own public identity brought this to her mother's door. She apologized to her mother on national television. She said, "I'm so sorry, Mommy." Nancy Guthrie is not a forensic case study. She is a woman who had lived in the same house for 50 years, who raised 3 children there, who removed her hearing aids at night and slept in complete silence in the place she knew best in the world, who stepped through her front door on the evening of January 31st the way she had stepped through it thousands of times before, with no way of knowing that the home she had always felt safe in had already been studied, planned around, and selected. The forensic evidence does not resolve what happened to Nancy after February 1st. It does not tell us where she is. It does not name who took her, but it tells us, with the precision of blood that fell slowly, circularly, undisturbed at a threshold, that what happened inside that home was calculated, that the person who did it was in control, that they left evidence they may not know they left, and that the investigation into that evidence is ongoing. As of late March 2026, the DNA recovered from inside the home remains under analysis. No identification match has been produced. Genetic genealogy analysis, the same methodology that identified the Golden State Killer through partial matches in public databases, is reportedly being applied to this case. The pacemaker technology scanning for Nancy's unique Bluetooth signal continues to be deployed. The combined reward for information stands at more than $1,100,000. The blood at the front entrance of Nancy Guthrie's home tells part of the story. It tells us where she was when she began bleeding visibly. It tells us how she was moved, It tells us the person who moved her was not panicking. And it tells us that somewhere, on the back of a piece of clothing that a person may have forgotten to check, there is evidence that no amount of cleaning may be able to fully erase. That is the detail that could still break this case. The evidence the perpetrator did not know to destroy. The thing that no operational checklist accounts for. The blood that fell where he could not see it. That is the detail that could still break this case. The evidence the perpetrator did not know to destroy. The thing that no operational checklist accounts for. The blood that fell where he could not see it. There is one final forensic thread in this case that has not received the attention it deserves alongside the blood evidence, the doorbell camera bracket. The perpetrator approached Nancy's Nest doorbell camera at 1:47 a.m. He touched that device. FBI Director Kash Patel confirmed that the intruder attempted to knock the camera off with light taps, and when that failed, covered the lens with foliage from a potted plant nearby. That interaction, physical contact with the bracket, the lens, the surrounding housing, is a forensic opportunity. A gloved hand touches a surface with a specific kind of pressure. Trace evidence transfers. Biological material from inside the glove or from the point where the glove material meets the skin at the wrist can transfer to a surface in ways that are recoverable under laboratory conditions. The bracket was not collected for approximately 3 weeks after the crime. Dr. Valentine described the implications precisely. DNA evidence and trace biological material degrade over time. The desert environment around Tucson in February, UV radiation, heat fluctuation between day and night, particulate matter in the air, accelerates that degradation. Every day the bracket remained attached to the wall or in the environment before being collected was a day in which the potential forensic value of any biological transfer on that surface diminished. 3 weeks is not a small gap. In a case where forensic evidence is the primary investigative driver, 3 weeks is the difference between a usable DNA sample and a compromised one. The FBI confirmed that data was successfully recovered from the doorbell camera device despite the perpetrator's attempts to disable it. That recovery was a significant investigative achievement, but the bracket that held the device, the surface the perpetrator touched with his hands, sat in the environment for 21 days before anyone treated it as the piece of evidence it was. Together, the welcome mat, the camera bracket, and the 30-hour crime scene release represent 3 points at which the forensic record of what happened at Nancy Guthrie's home may have been compromised, not through negligence in the ordinary sense, through the pressure that Dr. Valentine has described repeatedly as the condition under which unforced errors occur in high-profile investigations. The pressure to show activity, the pressure to release the scene back to a grieving family, the pressure of national media cameras outside a front door, documenting every detail of an investigation that the entire country was watching. Dr. Valentine's point is not that investigators failed. His point is that forensic methodology exists precisely to protect against the kind of pressure that was present at every stage of this case's early hours. The methodology says, hold the scene, collect the mat, collect the bracket, process methodically. Let the evidence reveal its story before you allow the scene to be released. Those standards were not fully applied here, and the investigation is now working from a forensic foundation that is less complete than it should be. That is not a closed question. That is an open one, the kind of open question that this case will carry with it for as long as it remains unsolved. Which part of this forensic analysis do you find most significant? The location of the blood inside the front entrance, and what it tells us about the absence of evidence in the bedroom, the satellite spatter at the threshold, and what it reveals about the time spent there, or the possibility of blood on the perpetrator's clothing that he may never have thought to address. Leave your analysis in the comments. This is a real woman and a real family. Engage with the gravity that deserves. If this investigation reached you, if it brought the evidence into focus in a way that matters, subscribe to Unclosed Files. Hit the notification bell. We follow the forensic trail wherever it leads, on this case and on every case that still demands answers. New documentary investigations every week. We do not look away. If you have any information about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or visit tips.fbi.gov. The reward is real, and every detail, however small it seems, may be the piece that finally brings Nancy home. This documentary was presented with respect for Nancy Guthrie and her family. Our goal is to examine the evidence, ask the questions that the forensic record raises, and search for truth, not to sensationalize tragedy. These cases deserve serious, thorough, and forensically grounded coverage. Thank you for approaching this case with the gravity it deserves.